Hi everyone, my name is Zora Kazi. Wait, hold on, pause. Hi everyone, my name is Zora Kazi. I'm a rising senior at the University of Central Florida. Under the mentorship and guidance of Dr. Michelle Hong of the Northwestern, reading. Hi everyone, my name is Zora Kazi. I'm a rising senior at the University of Central Florida. And under the mentorship and guidance of Dr. Michelle Hong of the Northwestern's English department, I worked on my research project titled Contained Identities, Politics of Personal Poetics in Experimental Asian American Literature. Unfortunately, my home institution, UCF, doesn't have an Asian American Studies program. So I came into Northwestern's SROP not having a foundation in the critical works of the field. I spent most of my time studying and reading critical texts and building myself a strong background in Asian American Studies. I learned a lot about the common themes and ideas that the field had explored, namely identity, assimilation, gender and class differences, just to name a few. However, one thing that was understudied within the field was poetry, especially experimental poetry. Experimental or avant-garde is generally defined by its distance from the normal, like the norm, and the generalized way of producing and creating art. However, this form of writing wasn't studied as extensively within Asian American studies, something that I wanted to try and investigate. So with this background in mind, I asked how do writers use formal poetic techniques. So with this background in mind, I asked how do writers use formal poetic techniques, that is like form and diction, and what are those techniques saying, especially in relation to Asian American themes like identity? Why do Asian American writers experience pause? So with this background in mind, I ask, how do writers use formal poetic techniques like form and diction? And what are those techniques saying, especially in relation to Asian American themes like identity? And why do identity? Like identity. Why do Asian American writers experiment with formal poetics? And how and why is this use of experimental formal poetics deemed political? And by political, at least for the purposes of my research, I mean race. I mean race, racial oppression, racial differences, and so on. Because in American literature, we tend to racialize, we tend to see racialized texts or texts that are very clearly ethnic to be political. Race in America generally is political. So with this background in mind, I ask, how do writers use formal poetic techniques, that is form and diction, and what are those techniques saying, especially in relation to Asian American themes like identity and assimilation? And why do Asian American writers experiment with formal poetics, and how and why is this use of experimental formal poetics deemed political? And by political, at least for the purpose of my research, I mean race, racial oppression, racial differences, so on. Because in American literature, we tend to see racialized texts or texts that are very clearly ethnic to be political. Race in America generally is a very political topic. For my research, I specifically focused on Theresa Kyung Cha's Dictee, a critically acclaimed novel within the field of Asian American studies that was published in the 1980s. Dictee that covers the story of several women, but is done so in a pretty experimental way, which I'll talk about more. I'll talk more about in a bit. As I focused on this novel, I centered my close reading on two experimental aspects of the novel: narration and form, which I will talk about in a bit. My research, I specifically focused on Theresa Kyung's Dictee, a critically acclaimed novel within the field of Asian American studies that was published in the 1980s. Dictee covers the story of several women, but is done so in a pretty experimental way, which I'll definitely talk about in a bit. And as I focused primarily on this novel for my research, I centered my close reading on two experimental aspects of the novel: narration and form. But as some background to who Theresa Kyung is, she is a multimedia artist who specialized mostly in film. So a lot of her work was a lot of her work was film. She was a University of California student. So a lot of her, she specialized in film. So a lot of her work, we can clearly see like a shit specialized in film. So we can see a lot of influence in that. A lot of theoretical film work, like studying images by the frame rather than its whole. She's an experimental, so it does play into that. For my research, I specifically focused on Theresa Kyung's Dictee, a critically acclaimed novel within the field of Asian American studies that was published in the 1980s. Dictee covers the story of several women, but is done so in a really experimental way, which I'll, of course, talk about in a bit. The novel, while many critics seem to label as an autobiography, largely avoids any sort of clear or easy categorization due to the experimental and hybrid elements at work. As I focused primarily on this novel for my research, I centered my close reading on two experimental aspects of the novel: narration and form. In Dictee, Cha uses several speakers because there are several speakers as there are several subjects. She's covering a lot of characters, so as there are several subjects. Interestingly, the first person singular I is actually never embodied, meaning that it's never fixed onto a singular or singular tangible singular tangible person or subject. It's a very fluid and moving. It's very fluid in the context of the novel, moving through different subjects and stories. At some points, I'm the I, but at some points the I transforms and shifts between first person plural into the first person plural we, as we see in the image on the left, which is like a screenshot from the book. Um, This ever-shifting I, as well as as well as the multiple speakers and subjects essentially support the idea that our identities are ever shifting and changing, and also because they're ever shifting and changing, are even conflicting with one another at sometimes. We're both, in this sense, in the case of this novel specifically, in this paragraph, we're both the as the individual and the we as the collective at the same time, which clearly is a conflicting thing. In Dictee, Cha uses several speakers as there are several subjects. Interestingly, the first person singular I, is actually never embodied, meaning that it's never fixed onto a singular tangible person or subject. It's a very fluid thing within this novel, meaning that it moves through different subjects and stories and is just kind of everywhere and nothing at the same time. At some points, too, the I transforms and shifts between first person, plural, wait, no, shit, cut. In Dictee, Cha uses several speakers as there are several subjects. Interestingly, the first person singular I is never actually embodied, meaning that it's never fixed onto a singular or tangible person or subject. It's a very fluid thing within this novel, meaning that it moves through different subjects and stories. But at some points, this I transforms and shifts between the first person plural we, as seen in the image on the left. It's a screenshot from one of the chapters in the book, or I guess sections. This ever shifting I, as well as the multiple speakers and subjects, essentially supports this idea that our identities are also ever shifting and changing, and possibly even conflicting because it's changing so much. We're consistently and constantly both the I as the individual and the we as the collective at the same time. And by the same time, I mean the present, because in this novel, the same time is often present. Both the singular I and the singular I and the plural we is both in the present moment. And the form in Dictee is also really interesting. Because Cha's own background as a multimedia artist, this novel is very visual and asks its audience to read the novel in challenging and new ways. There's like a variety of images, texts, and even documents like handwritten letters and portraits throughout the novel, which really add another layer to the novel itself as you read it. The form also kind of extends to like the actual form of writing as well, ranging from like prose to poetry to like a series of questions. Um, Here's like some of the examples of like the hybrid images that Cha uses within the book. One of the major themes in Dictee um, explores language, and it is clearly reflected in the images that Cha uses. A lot of these images kind of also can be like read and are expected to be treated in the same way you would treat a text. Like they're very heavy in language. You would have to like take time to read and try to decipher these images and read them as they would be like normal, like a poetry or prose. You would have to treat them like they're a written text. Go. So after analyzing and closely reading Dictee with a focus of narration and form and reading several books in the Asian American literature canon over the past 7 weeks, my questions sort of shifted. I soon understood why these texts were labeled political, which was because of their closeness to race, which I defined as political earlier. Oftentimes, academia sort of puts this label on works that discuss or even are written by writers that are of a racial minority. So like therefore race kind of acts like a container it kind of traps a lot of writers into this box of expectations and modes of study, that their work can only be really viewed as one thing and not something else. So during my readings, this question of why something is political soon became how. More specifically, how should we be reading these texts? From a lot of the critical work happening within the field of Asian American studies, it was really clear that a lot of the work was limiting the text to the writer, as in the critical work and the critical scholars of the field were focusing more on the author rather than the text that the author had written. If we're going to study and read literature, especially experimental literature, we need to study and closely examine the techniques that were used within the piece itself and how these two are ways to talk about themes, ideas, personal histories, and political experiences. Of course, 7 weeks is nowhere near enough time to fully research this topic and go in depth with it. So going forward, I do plan on expanding and continuing this research by including more literary works into this discussion, starting with Pamela Liu's Pamela, a novel. It's a very experimental novel, and so I wanted to continue my research exploring the experimental nodes and like the techniques within this novel. So I want to read this novel in the way I had suggested reading more, and suggested in the way I attempted to read Dictee, by closely examining the novel for its formal poetics and the formal techniques as a way, like they are ways to talk about the larger themes found within the text, but they're also ways to talk about race. There's a lot more that needs to be done, of course, within this field to broaden our horizons. And I hope that this research is just a step forward in that direction. Thank you.